Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Philip Buckler. I am a dentist, and I also happen to be a major in the Army. Think of that as junior middle management. I apologize for the choppy nature of this presentation. That's because, while this is not the most time-consuming video I've made in my life, it is definitely the hardest as far as the circumstances surrounding it. Please bear with me. I've done my best to clean it up. I'm making this video because the combination of Army policy and my conscience, which is informed by sincerely held religious belief, have boxed me into a corner. And it sucks. So what current, ongoing Army policy could possibly produce such a painful violation of religious conscience that a soldier would eventually feel compelled to refuse to follow all such orders? In the current context of January 2022, I'm sure at least one possibility immediately jumps to your mind. It's not that, though it is related. In my case, the issue is the Army policy that requires all soldiers to wear a face mask when in uniform. This, for me, is a violation of conscience. It has been since March of 2020. And it's only gotten progressively worse. I compromised my conscience, ignored it, and tried to go along to get along as little as possible while still doing enough to stay out of trouble. If anyone has a good excuse to wear a mask, it's soldiers. But my conscience won't let me do it anymore. So if you wondered why some people have objected to wearing a face mask, if it doesn't make any sense to you, and if it just sounds totally crazy as to why someone would have a religious-based case against face masks, perhaps I can help articulate at least some of those reasons. I suspect that a lot of people who have resisted wearing face masks grasp these intuitively but have had trouble voicing them. Anyone who sees this video is welcome to use those arguments if these speak to their conscience. If you are watching this video, it means that more than likely there's a second video of me floating around the internet, also in uniform, my dress uniform, and that video was recorded in December of 2020. Personally, I believe that the empirical evidence against the efficacy of masks is more than sufficient to preclude any kind of mask mandate, even if one adopts a utilitarian framework of ethics. If one is not a utilitarian, I believe that the generalized moral objections are sufficient to preclude masking on their own. I did my best to make some of those points in my previous video. I deliberately steered away from religious-based arguments. I did that because I thought everyone would discount what I had to say if I made religious-based arguments. They would say, oh, he's making religious-based arguments. That's really the reason. He doesn't actually believe what he's saying as far as the secular arguments or the scientific arguments. And it's an irony not lost on me that it's the religious arguments that I deliberately avoided for more than 10 months, which may actually be the ones that are the most effective. To a certain extent, all moral arguments have a religious element, and that's because if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That's just the way it is. If God does not exist, then we're all just biological accidents that terminate at the end of our lives. And if objective moral values and duties do not exist, then there's nothing really wrong with not wearing a mask, and there's nothing really wrong with forcing people to wear a mask, and there's nothing really wrong with giving someone a disease. And I would argue that all people have a sense of what is right and wrong, because God has written his moral law on all of our hearts. Why is wearing a face mask, for me, a violation of sincerely held religious belief and conscience? First, it makes me a false witness. And it does this through the mechanism of symbolic speech. We all know that humans communicate through a variety of means. Words are not the only one. And the courts have recognized this as well. The Supreme Court in 1943 pointed out that symbols are a primitive but powerful form of communication. They are a shortcut from mind to mind, as Justice Robert H. Jackson said. And, quite frankly, that is what masks are. You may object at this point that masks are simply a medical intervention. And, for many people, that is true. They are a medical intervention. But that is not all they are. Masks being a medical intervention does not preclude the possibility of masks also being a symbolic gesture. Masks check all of the behavioral psychology boxes very effectively. Let me just list 3 of those. The first one being that they are a foot in the door. They are a small gesture that can be used to open the door later to greater and more extreme actions. Mask compliance with masking was responsible for the struggle we are now engaged in with the vaccine, but it would have never gotten to this point if there had been more pushback on the masks. The action which masks led to, or helped facilitate, can also serve as a foot in the door to more extreme actions. That sounds like a slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slope arguments, however, are not always a fallacy. And let me quote the Supreme Court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. And that decision led to the forcible sterilization of tens of thousands of American women." So, foot in the door is the first behavioral psychology mechanism by which masks act. The second one is the one that makes me a false witness: social modeling. In fancy legal speak, you could call it symbolic affirmation of a repugnant belief. Social modeling, fancy psychology speak for setting an example. What coerced and compulsory masking does is it forces people who disagree with it to act in a way that says something other than what their words are saying. It gives anyone who watches them or listens to them strong evidence that they don't actually believe what they are saying. It makes them contradict themselves. It makes their actions say one thing, and it makes their words say another. Social modeling is extremely powerful. But for now, keep in mind that social modeling is probably the ultimate reason that people will come after me for making this video, because they don't like the example that I'm setting. The examples from social modeling can be all out of proportion to someone's actual power, and the reactions to them can be completely out of proportion to someone's intrinsic infection control risk, however much you believe masks affect or don't affect that. Third, self-labeling of helpfulness. That's a fancy way of saying virtue signaling. It also has some elements in common with the Pygmalion effect. You label yourself as something and you begin to act like it, or do things which would tend to get you that label more often. Expectations creating reality, essentially, or influencing reality. In the case of masks, if you are told by a bunch of authority figures that you are being helpful and that you are a good person if you wear masks, then that's what you're going to do, and you're going to think of yourself as a good person, because who doesn't want to think of themselves as a good person? Masks make me violate the commandment not to lie, not to bear false witness against my neighbor. Second, and connected to this issue, is the issue of living out the second greatest commandment. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And many people are going to jump in here and say, well, the only way you can love your neighbor as yourself is to wear a mask. I could not disagree more. The commandment is, love thy neighbor as thyself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is not, love thy neighbors better than thyself, and it is also very much not, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Both of those are misunderstandings and misapplications of the commandment. In the first case, others' preferences are determinative. In the proper application, others' preferences may influence your ultimate decision, but they are not determinative. In my case, wearing a mask makes me constantly violate the second greatest commandment. I don't want my neighbors to wear a mask around me. I very much do not want my neighbors to wear a mask around me. I want them to investigate the evidence for themselves to the extent that they have time and are willing to do so. I want them to think critically about many of the issues surrounding this. I want their children to play with my son unmasked. I want people to have a realistic risk assessment. I do not want people taking responsibility for other people's health. You are not responsible for your neighbor's health down the street. If you accidentally cut someone off in traffic and they go home and start beating their spouse, you are not responsible for that. If someone catches a cold from you and 7 or 8 removes down the line, someone dies, you are not morally culpable for that. That is my firm conviction. So wearing a mask at all except in a context where its use was common in my profession, when my face is 18 to 24 inches away from that of a patient and I am aerosolizing the contents of their mouth into my face. Any usage in any other context short of that is a violation of conscience, because I am not treating my neighbor as I wish to be treated when I do that. If people want me to wear a mask and they want to set that example for me, they are welcome to do so, but they must limit themselves to persuasion, not to coercion. Next, I believe that many of our root judicial principles, including the presumption of innocence, can be derived from what is found in the Bible. Forcing everyone to go around masked violates that presumption. Yes, I'm aware of what universal infection control entails, but to inflict it on the entire population, or even to inflict it by coercion on any individual healthcare provider, is a violation of that biblical judicial principle. You are innocent until you are proven guilty. The same principle that would have everyone wear a mask because you can't prove that you aren't infectious is the same principle that got people burned because they couldn't prove that they weren't witches. It is immoral and it needs to stop. Fourth, the Bible is filled with symbolic language which recognizes a deeper truth. If you hide your face from someone, you are essentially distancing yourself from them. You are indicating displeasure with them. This language is ubiquitous throughout the Bible. If you show someone your face, if you turn your face toward them, if you speak with them face to face, then you are showing them favor. You are inviting them into a form of fellowship. You are being open with them. This language is in the Bible for a reason. It recognizes a deeper truth that humans are social beings. And one of the insidious things about masks is that they disrupt this social bond. If someone wants to socially distance themselves from everyone, I mean that in both a psychological and a physical way, if they want to do so, they are welcome to. I will not come into their house and inflict my presence on them against their will. But in public, they have no right to force other people to wear a mask. Not wearing masks violates my personal application of Christian practices and principles for worship, which have been in effect for thousands of years, including through plagues, next to which COVID-19 pales by comparison. The church has existed throughout many plagues. Even during the worst plagues, it was not common for Christians to wear masks in close fellowship. Finally, I believe that in my case, wearing a mask requires me to be de facto forsworn in honoring an oath that I took under a biblically based understanding, and that is my oath to defend the Constitution against threats both foreign and domestic. What's the connection? How does this work? The Constitution does not specifically speak to wearing masks, but it has a lot to say about freedom of speech and freedom of religious practice. One of the problems with mask wearing, and with all symbolic gestures that are mandated, is that it changes compliance into complicity. Freedom of speech includes freedom of silence. And in cases where there is no middle ground, ultimately the discretion must be left up to the individual. And thankfully, Congress actually did something useful when they passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to make that even more explicit, though personally I believe that accurate application of the First Amendment would be sufficient to render all mask orders presumptively unlawful and unconstitutional. Again, because of their symbolic value, because they are a form of symbolic speech. Even if you grant that they are a form of medical intervention, they are also a form of symbolic speech. And because masks are a form of symbolic speech, whether to wear them or not wear them, that must remain optional. That decision must be voluntary and confined to individuals. It would be just as wrong to prevent people from wearing masks in this context when they sincerely believe that they should be, as it would be to force people to wear a mask. The Declaration of Independence is also relevant here. The Declaration of Independence is not the Constitution, and it does not have the same force of law. However, it does articulate the moral basis on which this country was founded, that every man is created equal and has a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, liberty being key. And the right to life does not entail the right to force one's neighbor to give up their job, stay at home, or wear a mask, all on the chance that it may prevent someone somewhere from catching a disease with a 0.15 infection fatality rate. It also renders using a third party to do the compelling just as immoral. These values are not limited to American citizens. They inhere in all of mankind. These rights are granted by the Creator. They are not a product of government. All men possess them, whether or not they live in America. Americans happen to be blessed enough to live in a country that was founded by people who sincerely believed that and who recognized it and enshrined those principles in their Declaration of Independence and Constitution. It may be that one of the major silver linings to come out of all this is that people across the world who do not live in America will stand up and explicitly enshrine those inalienable rights into their own constitutions. It's certainly not too late. But as for me, I believe that those inalienable rights are inherent, implicit, and undergird our American Constitution, and I swore to defend that Constitution. Now that I've presented the positive case for why it's a violation of sincerely held religious conscience for me to wear a mask in any context other than which it was worn commonly in my profession prior to 2020, I think I need to address some of the counter-arguments that have probably sprung to people's mind. The first one being, Christians disagree. This isn't really a religious argument. Of course Christians disagree. That objection confuses moral ontology with moral epistemology. Ontology, the objective basis for moral values and duties versus our ability to know those moral values and duties, and also conflates and confuses absolute versus relative versus objective subjective. And there's a certain bitter humor in my observation that a lot of people who I think don't think moral values and duties exist objectively somehow think it's always objectively wrong to not wear a mask in these circumstances. But we need to avoid making the mistake of confusing our ability to accurately perceive the specific application of a particular moral value and duty with the objective existence of that moral value and duty. For something to exist objectively means that it exists separately, on its own, apart from people's belief. This can lead to a lot of confusion because it's easy to confuse something's objective existence with it being absolute. Objectivity versus subjectivity, absolute versus relative. If something is absolute, it applies to all people at all times regardless of circumstances. A lot of people see that moral values and duties supervene differently on different people in different contexts and times and places, and then conclude from that these values and duties are not objective. It's easy to confuse objective and subjective, that dichotomy, with absolute versus relative. Now, there are some moral values and duties that are absolute. For example, every human's moral value and duty to worship God and no one else. But the vast majority of moral values and duties that we interact with on a daily basis don't have this kind of absolute application to our day-to-day circumstances. A lot of those values and duties shift in priority based on individual circumstances. So it's entirely possible that one person's moral duty is to wear a mask. But it's equally possible that another person right next to them could have a similar moral obligation to not wear a mask. For all those of you who are convinced of the moral rectitude of wearing masks, how it is so morally essential, ask yourself, are you so convinced of that belief that if your employer or your governor said nobody can wear a mask, that you would continue wearing a mask? Are you so convinced of the moral superiority of wearing a mask that you would be willing to give up your career in order to wear a mask? Think about it. You don't stake your career or give up your career based on beliefs that you're not sure of. One argument that I've seen way too often, Jesus would have worn a mask. First of all, that's not an argument, that's an assertion. Secondly, I think that completely misapprehends Jesus' character and also what he did. It may interest some people to know that Jesus, to make a point, declined to wash his hands before eating at a dinner party he was invited to. Keep in mind that a lot of dinner parties in first century Palestine involved communal dishes. Jesus did this to make a point which his host and most of the people there considered highly insulting. The person who records it, the gospel writer who actually records this incident, was the physician, Luke. Okay, well, Jesus is a special case. So, what did Jesus' disciples do? But when the Pharisees and teachers of the law pointed out to Jesus that his disciples hadn't washed their hands before eating, and I would like to note here that washing your hands has a much stronger evidential connection to disease transmission than does wearing a face mask, instead of getting mad at his disciples, Jesus came back at the Pharisees. And Jesus used that as a teaching moment for his disciples and for the people around him to illustrate that it's not what goes into a person's body that makes them unclean, but what comes out. And the examples that Jesus gave has nothing to do with biomaterials, has nothing to do with bacteria. It's not viral either. What do you think Jesus would have said to a Pharisee or a priest or a Levite or a doctor who told someone with unblemished skin that they should behave like a leper? What do you think he would have told to those people if they had forced people with unblemished skin to behave like lepers? Because that's what our public health establishment is doing. I think that Jesus would have had some very harsh words for such people, especially the people who should know better. The Bible specifically says that Jesus came to deliver all those who, through fear of death, were subject to lifelong slavery. And I don't think Jesus would have worn a mask, because that would have contributed to lifelong slavery. And the Bible says that it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. It warns us not to use our freedom as a covering for evil. That's true. But as I've already said, it may be individual Christians' moral duty to refuse to wear masks. Refusing to wear a mask is not always morally evil. It never has been, not even in March of 2020. And quite frankly, based on the empirical evidence that I've seen coming out of operating rooms, it might not even necessarily be a moral evil for a surgeon to refuse to wear a mask. And if someone wants to try that out and I need an elective surgery, I volunteer to participate in such a trial. For all people who want to debate me on the empirical efficacy of masks, I'd be quite happy to have that debate with you in a very public forum. People arguing that all Christians should wear masks have pointed out that Jesus didn't insult or belittle people, that he went out of his way to come alongside them. To a certain extent, that's true, but also keep in mind that this is a guy who, when his disciples were afraid of capsizing in their fishing boat in the middle of a bad storm, said, "Why do you have so little faith?" Now, if I was a disciple, I would find that rather offensive. So would Jesus have worn a mask? I don't think so. Let me tell you a story, and most of you are probably already familiar with it. If you're not familiar with it, go read the book of Esther. Even if you just treat it as any other ancient historical document, it still is worth a read. But in the book of Esther, the king made a policy. It was the king's policy that every one of his subjects, or at least of his nobles, in the citadel of Susa, should kneel before Haman the Agagite and do him honor. Well, there was one man in the citadel of Susa by the name of Mordecai who refused to do so. He was the king's subject. The king had lawful authority, and it was the king's policy that Mordecai kneel before Haman and do him honor. We know from other contexts that kneeling before Haman and doing him honor would not be considered an act of worship. But Mordecai, for whatever reason, refused to honor the king's policy. He refused to follow it. And every time Haman walked by and saw Mordecai not bowing, Haman got angrier and angrier. So every time you walk by someone without wearing a mask, especially someone that you've just ordered to wear a mask or that you know is violating a policy to wear a mask, and you see them, now you know, at least on some level, what Haman felt like. So Mordecai's co-workers talked to him, and they said over and over again, "Why don't you just kneel to Haman? The king commanded it." But Mordecai would not. It specifically says that, at least in the NIV translation, it specifically says that Mordecai would not comply day after day. Now, the author of Esther does not say whether Mordecai was morally right in doing so. It's easy to argue that all the Jews in the Persian Empire were in it together. And certainly Mordecai's failure to kneel did precipitate a major crisis that could have gotten a lot of people killed. We all know that Haman had a COVID-level overreaction to seeing Mordecai not kneeling. But Mordecai wouldn't do it. I don't know whether he was right to do it or not. The author of Esther simply does not comment. But the people who are saying everyone should wear a mask, everyone must get the jab, that mentality would force us to read Esther as putting Mordecai in the same villainous league with Haman. And that's clearly not the author's intent. One of the reasons I like the book of Esther is because it gives you a glimpse into genuinely ambiguous human conditions. Oftentimes in the Bible, people don't know what the right thing to do is, or they're not sure. And sometimes they try to force God's hand. Usually when they try to do that, it ends poorly. And sometimes it's very difficult to know when doing something is trying to force God's hand or when it's taking initiative in faith. And keep in mind that faith is not what you think. The Greek word pistis means it's a strong trust in someone or something. Faith does not mean belief against all evidence. That's not what it means. That's not what it ever meant. Redefining words is part of the issue here. Redefining words like turning inaction or refusal to participate in one or more medical interventions to combat a virus as an active form of assault. Verbal rhetoric by politicians and some doctors has been used to conflate active attempts to infect someone, we don't have a right to infect others, with the same risk that we all incur simply by existing in a world full of living microscopic organisms. I agree that we don't have a right to infect others. But again, to take that and say that that justifies everyone wearing a mask is a total non sequitur, the most elementary of logical fallacies. It involves a host of unspoken moral assumptions, which, if they had to be articulated and defended, would not hold up under scrutiny, assuming that they even could be articulated. Likewise, with the argument that masks work. Coerced masking rests on two pillars. The empirical case, that masks actually mitigate or decrease or retard the spread of pathogens, including respiratory viruses, and the moral case that says if something works, we can force everyone to do it. That's the missing pillar. That's never been adequately supported through this entire thing. Biblical teachings do not support this. Basic logic does not support this. And the Constitution of the United States does not support this. But, you might say, it's the government's responsibility to provide for the general welfare. That's true. But the general welfare is not reducible solely to public health. Liberty, individual liberty, is part of the general welfare. Religious conscience is part of the general welfare. Freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom, as the Supreme Court has already ruled. Even the most robust interpretation of freedom of speech does not justify voluntarily and falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic. I completely agree with this. So what does that imply about forcing people to symbolically shout plague in a crowded community and cause a panic? Think about it. Your right to swing your fist ends with my face. I agree. Just like my right to public health ends with your face, and vice versa. People like to make the traffic laws analogy, that wearing a mask for public health is just like following traffic laws. I don't think so. Wearing a mask for public health is more like presuming that all drivers on the road are drunk, and then forcing everyone, regardless of their driving history, including people who don't drink, to install a breathalyzer on their car. God help us if that attitude becomes widespread. One argument that I've heard made by some pastors, especially on the internet, is that the Apostle Paul's instructions for people of strong faith to limit the use of their freedom to bear with their weaker brothers applies to masks, such that those of us who have strong faith and don't need to wear masks, should limit our freedom and put on masks for the sake of our weaker brothers. That argument cuts both ways, depending on how you frame it. You could just as easily say that all those people who refuse to wear masks, like myself, those are the people of weak faith, and that everyone with strong faith who doesn't feel their faith threatened by wearing a mask should take off their mask to support their weaker brothers. And so, since this argument cuts both ways, it is not successful in providing a good biblical basis for wearing a mask. Some people have argued that asserting rights is all about you, that wearing a mask is the only way to show care and concern for the feelings and comfort of others. At first glance, this is a good argument, but only at first glance. The reason for this is that each half of the statement is possibly true, but not necessarily true. Asserting rights can be all about you, but not always. And oftentimes, when you assert an individual liberty, everyone benefits, even those people who disagree with you. And there's a strong biblical injunction to speak up for the rights of the poor and destitute, the people who can't speak for themselves. So it's not true that asserting rights is always all about yourself. It can be, but whether or not it is between an individual and God. And either way, other people benefit when you do that. Likewise, wearing a mask is not always all about your feelings and care and concern for other people. It could just be you trying to go along to get along or look like a good person, and you know what Jesus said about doing your good deeds to be seen by others. Unfortunately, when it comes to masking, there's no middle ground that I can think of. You either wear one or you don't. So in cases like that, where the ideology and the medical intervention and the public statement or silence are so inextricably intertwined that one cannot be separated from the other, then such things must remain voluntary. The same principles that permit conscientious objection during times of actual war against another nation, times of national survival, must permit individuals to abstain from one or more medical interventions when it comes to fighting a virus. The same principles that forbid us from mandating beneficial altruistic actions, such as post-mortem organ donation, also forbid us from mandating masks and vaccines. You might say that people don't have a right to impose risk on others. And that's true, but again, that uses verbal rhetoric to transmute a duty to do no harm into a duty to assist. Just because something is good does not mean you have the moral obligation to do it. It would be good for you to become a doctor and save lives. But that is not a moral obligation or a moral duty for most people. It would be good for you to become a farmer and grow food. Everyone needs food. But that's not a moral obligation either. And so what rhetorical political statements like that do is that they transmute a duty to do no harm into an open-ended duty to assist. Life isn't safe. It never was. And safety, while it has its place, can never be our top priority. It must never take the position of a religion. And we've seen mask wearing acquire all the hallmarks of a religion. I believe that public health has been elevated to an idolatrous status. The moral duty to worship the Lord your God and serve him only is not simply applicable to idols, to figures of wood and stone. Idolatry can take many forms, and it doesn't necessarily have to be applied to things that are intrinsically bad in and of themselves. The act of idolatry consists of elevating something, whether it's good or bad, above the level of God. For a lot of people, public health has reached the point where it has become idolatrous. Plenty of Christians, maybe even a majority of Christians, will disagree with the stance that I've taken. And it may very well be that their moral duty is to wear a mask. That's between them and God. But that's for them to decide. Not their pastor, not their governor, not their public health official. That is between them and God. Matters of religion are no less important than matters of public health. It took us hundreds of years and thousands of lives to figure out that coercion is wrong in matters of religion. And if it's wrong in matters of religion, then it's no less wrong in matters of public health like this. To a certain extent, I understand where this impulse, this inaction is direct harm, comes from. I can think of at least one point in the Bible that could be read that way, at least at first glance. And that's when, in the book of James, James the Apostle writes to Christians, "He who knows the good he ought to do but doesn't do it sins." Some translations render it, "He who knows the right thing to do but doesn't do it sins." That sounds like it conflates inaction and action, that could be applied to mask wearing. But again, I think that's a misapplication of that verse. The key words is he who knows the good he ought to do. And the good that everyone ought to do is individualized to themselves. That's between them and God. Who are you to presume to know what the good that someone else ought to do is? It's for the same reason that I can't tell you that you should take off your mask, although I think a lot of people probably are feeling the pricking of their conscience in this issue. But I don't know. I don't know your individual situation. The public health officials trying to force you to wear a mask also don't know your individual situation. Also in James, there's a very sobering warning. It says, "Let not many of you presume to become teachers, my brothers. For those of us who presume to teach will be judged by a higher standard." Well, anyone who sees this could understand why that might be applied to me. But the thing is, I'm not trying to teach everyone here. I'm trying to explain myself. Any teaching that I do is incidental in this video. My goal is to explain myself, to articulate the sincerely held religious beliefs that have led me to this decision. When you watch this, please watch this not as someone who is teaching you and trying to talk down to you, but as someone who is just as lost and screwed up and messed up as person as you are. I can't even meet the normal standard. But that's kind of the point of Christianity, that nobody can. I've seen a lot of argument from pastors quoting Jesus' commandment to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's, and then saying that this means that every time you get an order like that, your responsibility is to obey it, and that anything else is rebellion against God. And I simply don't think that is true. I think that's a total misapplication. Caesar, when it comes to masks, Caesar is trying to take what never was his, never will be his, and never should be his. We all know that what is technically legal and what is lawful or just are often two different things. We often disagree about the specifics, but we all agree on that general principle. And the Bible repeatedly warns against using the law to pervert justice. Human nature has not changed over the last 3,500 years. That impulse is still present in everyone, and it needs to be resisted. And one of the most effective ways to prevent that is to decentralize that kind of power as much as possible. The founders of the American Republic knew this, and that's why they introduced the Federalist system, a voluntary union of peers, the states. And from a biblical precedent standpoint, situational imperatives may even mandate that lawful superiors are disobeyed. And I refer people to what happened when King Saul was fighting the Philistines and wanted to kill his son for disobeying one of his orders. And the people would not let him. Very properly, they rebelled against their king in that issue. Just like the American colonists rebelled against King George III. So all those people who want to, quote, render unto Caesar and interpret it so broadly that there is no room for resistance, passive or active, I think are simply misreading the Bible. But you might say, you're a soldier. You volunteered. So why are you disobeying orders now? You have no right to do so. All orders are presumed lawful. No. I did volunteer, and 1010 would do it again. Desmond Doss was a volunteer. If you don't know who that was, watch Hacksaw Ridge. And if I may take a moment to do so, I would like to say, go Army. If you don't have a problem with masks or vaccines, it's a very good option. I've had the pleasure of serving alongside men and women who are far better people than me, both in terms of physical strength and moral character. But not all orders are presumptively lawful. And the fact that I'm a volunteer does not magically expand the definition of what constitutes a lawful order. I believe that compulsory masking would be wrong even if it were forced on slaves and prisoners of war, much less American citizens, whether free, conscripts, or volunteers. And ultimately, I believe that the Army will honor its policy and follow its own rules. If the Army honors its own policies, which they have in writing, and which I made a good faith effort to adhere to, then I believe they will ultimately respect and accommodate individuals like myself, the Navy SEALs who are currently in the courts, and other similarly situated individuals. Unfortunately, many people, not just in the armed services but elsewhere, tend to have an attitude that I think is best exemplified in a statement by Pliny the Younger. Most of you have probably never heard of him, but he's a good writer, and his letters are entertaining. In one of his letters to the Emperor Trajan, he makes a very revealing statement. He wrote to the emperor and he said, I am convinced, I am persuaded, that whatever the confession, stubbornness and unbending obstinacy ought to be punished. I think a lot of people, as their knee-jerk reaction, would agree with that statement. But quite frankly, that attitude is more dangerous than any virus. The context of that statement was Pliny explaining to the Emperor Trajan why he had Christians executed for refusing to curse Christ. So everyone in government, everyone in a position of leadership, needs to watch themselves for that attitude, because it is not a good one. Connected with the compulsion of speech and the behavioral psychology aspect of wearing masks is the answer to a very common question that I hear. To you, when you're watching this, you may think that wearing a mask does not have an effect on your belief about whether or not you should wear a mask. And I sincerely hope that's true. It may very well be true for you. But it is not true. It is demonstrably false about the general population. And we know that from the exit survey from Bungert et al.'s randomized controlled trial about whether masks actually work or not to stop SARS-CoV-2. For those of us who have been willing to pay for the supplemental data from that study, you can see the survey results that show that even just after 2 months of mask use, the percentage of people that believe that they should wear a mask rose by 16 to 18%. And that was in the absence of strong social compulsion, pressure, legal pressure, authority figure pressure, all of the above. Just that, the simple act of wearing a mask changed people's beliefs about whether they should wear a mask, about whether it was necessary. And this fact, I believe, provides a great deal of insight into answering the question of why doctors and surgeons wear masks. Masks came into use late in the 19th century as an infection control measure when germ theory was just being developed. Generations of doctors have been taught that they should wear a mask. Respected authority figures have always reinforced it, and most medical providers have routinely worn them rigorously in various patient healthcare settings. So if 2 months shifts people's beliefs in one direction 16 to 18%, think about what a surgeon who's worn a mask for more than 20 years might think. Doctors, experts, healthcare providers, they're no less vulnerable to behavioral psychology than anyone else. In some ways, they might be even more vulnerable to behavioral psychology because they're less aware of it. Oftentimes, being that intelligent entails a certain amount of pride. But physicians and healthcare providers are no less prone to things like confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, ad hominem fallacies, and behavioral psychology as anyone else. I don't claim to be immune to these things either. But that's part of the point. No one is. So the question is, who says that you should have the right to decide for yourself, your body, your children? And who is trying to coerce you? Most doctors have not done the research. Most did not have time to do it. Public health graduate degree programs do not have classes in masks. Because it is such a niche issue, nobody can become completely conversant of every possible aspect of medical field. An enthusiastic amateur in the dental field who's particularly interested in bonding agents can quickly acquire far more knowledge about the details of bonding agents, how they work, and how best to utilize them than most general dentists. And they can do this without a degree. And this seems like as good a time as any to issue an apology. Not for what I'm doing now. I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not sorry, and I would do it again. I'm going to apologize for what it took to get me to this point. Soldiers are supposed to be willing to give up their lives for their values, to give up their lives to defend the country they love that they swore to defend. It took me, the effort it took to get me to this point makes me ashamed. I had the worst hesitation about even potentially sacrificing my career, much less my life. My life was never under threat during this. I had a much lower threshold for doing something like this than I would have hoped. And I'm sorry that it's taken me this long. If I had more to lose, like a lot of the people that I know, I probably would not be doing this. If I had more children or if I had a higher rank, for me, this was balanced on a knife blade, on a razor's edge. And so I can't judge those people who decided not to do it, who've decided not to speak out. For all those servicemen and women who have spoken out or have been fighting this on other fronts, especially the Navy SEALs who are really leading the way in the court, I want to say thank you. But for me, quite frankly, I'm ashamed that I was not able and not willing to sacrifice more for this. And I hope that I underestimated what I was willing to give up for this, because this is much bigger. This isn't the issues and the principles at stake here are worth more than any officer or politician's career. And they're worth far more than my personal well-being. But going through this experience has taught me that if I lived in other times, places, and contexts, I more than likely would have been, the smart money would have been betting on me doing things that all of us now look back on and find abhorrent. Rightly so. And while what the soldiers in those situations and other times and places did was wrong, I can understand now why they did it. And I can only pray that I might get to be part of the minority, ideally a successful minority, that turns back the tide and avoids ever putting any American or other servicemen and women in a position where they're faced with a choice between violating their conscience and following orders. No order which puts a service member in that kind of situation can be presumed lawful. I'm asking for help. What happens to me is not important. That's not why I'm asking for help. The help that I'm asking for is whatever anyone watching this feels led to do. If your conscience has been pricking you ever more persistently for the last 18 months, listen to it. If your body tells you that it has a harder time achieving full oxygenation while wearing a mask, your body probably knows more about you than some white lab coat on TV does. The thing that comes most to my mind in this case is sharing this video. Linking, sharing, reporting, talking about it. Because the first thing that someone in a bureaucratic position would want to do with an officer like me is to bury them. And if you can't successfully do that right off the bat, what you do is you send a little army of bureaucrats to comb through every piece of paperwork, every record, every person who's ever known them, to find some technical grounds to get them on. And then you try to shut them down that way. In the case of doctors, you threaten their license. It may interest people to know that in the case of military officers, a lot of states want to know every time you renew your license whether or not you have been discharged from the military under anything other than honorable conditions. And they can use that to deny your license, your livelihood, that you spent years acquiring. Licensure is just one of the things that's been weaponized to quell dissent here. If you wonder why a lot of doctors, especially doctors in the Army, have not been speaking out about this, that's the reason. Plenty of doctors have already been penalized for speaking out about this. But why should you support this effort that I'm making? I'll make it as simple as possible. Because if the greatest branch of the greatest military of the greatest country in the world can't force one soldier to shut up and wear a mask, then no mask mandate can stand. Then no teacher can force your child to wear a mask. No employer can force you to wear a mask. And the people watching this video who believe in masks know this. I believe that this is a spiritual war. And when it comes to physical fighting, that's not one of my strengths. The Army did not want me for that skill set. When the dentist is fighting, you know you're in trouble. But maybe that's a comment on where we're at right now. Coerced masking has been one of the psychological linchpins of the historic epoch that we have lived through and that we're still going through. And it's up to us today to decide how this ends. America's historical example is far from perfect, but it set some good ones in the past. And I think we can do it again. Aferte Gloria Nomini Eos, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you for your time.
Go. Proclaim liberty throughout all the lands, unto all the inhabitants thereof.